I remember saying in a video at the end of August that I probably wasn't going to be making a lot of Adidas content this fall because I wasn't going to be running in Adidas shoes and there just wasn't a lot going on. Well, Adidas really changed that. With the introduction of the Prime X2 Strung and then the Adios Pro Evo 1, Adidas has completely blown apart their tech stack for the Adizero line. So there is a ton to talk about. Now, I've already made a bunch of videos about the Prime X2 Strung and about the Evo 1. I'll put a link in the description to both of those. But this video is going to be about getting into the technical details of what are the implications of the technology that we saw in those two shoes and how is that going to impact the Adizero line moving forward. One of the biggest questions I had when I first saw the Prime X2 Strung was, what was that puck of foam between the two carbon fiber plates, between the two layers of Lightstrike Pro? Adidas was just calling it Lightstrike Pro. It wasn't really clear what it was, but it was clear that it was different, especially in the prototype version where it literally was a puck of foam that was separate from the rest of the shoe. Well, when we saw the Evo 1, it was quite clear what that foam is. That is the new, more open, lighter, more airy Lightstrike foam. Now, for the sake of clarification in this video, I'm going to call that Lightstrike Evo foam, just to distinguish it from Lightstrike Pro foam. I don't know what Adidas is going to call it. They're calling it Lightstrike Pro. That doesn't make any sense to me. I assume there'll be another product name for that because it's just too confusing because they're very different foams. But the implications of this more airy, open, softer foam are massive for Adizero. Now, the best place to start to really break this down is to look at the carbon in the shoes. Now, traditionally, Adidas has always used these rods. This is actually the plate that's out of the Adizero Adios Pro 3 and the Evo 1. It's the same plate, though the geometry is different. This is a technology that Adidas has really been using since the original Adios Pro. It is their marquee technology. It's meant to distinguish it from the other carbon plate shoes, mostly what Nike's doing, but it's always been a really good technical solution for Lightstrike Pro because Lightstrike Pro is a very dense, very firm foam. So these carbon rods, which are very delicate when compared to a full carbon plate, can exist in that firmer foam and be protected and not break and not overflex. And you don't run into a lot of problems with these very delicate sort of fingers of these rods in that firmer foam. But when you put it in a much softer foam like what's in the Evo 1, then you're going to have problems. You're going to have problems in a couple ways. The first one would be just the flex of the foam. So if we look at these cross sections of the energy rods or the rods that Adidas uses compared to just a carbon plate. This is a Nike carbon plate, but really any carbon plates can be the same. And this is a cross section of the forefoot of the shoe. So when you're looking at the unloaded foam, the neutral position, you can see that there's plenty of room, especially in a high stack shoe like the Evo 1 or an Adios Pro 3. There's a lot of room. So those rods are just, in the midsole, you're never really going to feel them. But when you compress that foam, and especially the more airy, more open foam that it seems like what Adidas is doing with the Evo 1 in the Lightstrike Evo foam, then you're going to run into some problems when you really compress that foam because each one of those rods is going to create sort of a zone around it that's going to be a little bit denser, which ultimately, if the foam is too thin, you're going to feel one of those rods on your foot. It's going to be a very annoying sensation because rods, to give them some structural rigidity, have more dimension than just a carbon plate. So if you look below, you can just see a straight carbon plate, which is a flat slab of carbon. When you compress foam, especially a very soft foam like Zoom X that Nike uses, you're compressing it, you get a zone around it, but you're not going to really get any sort of pressing into your foot, into the bottom of the foot, into a really sensitive part of the foot, because you have this flat piece of material, but not so much with the rods. So if Adidas is exploring a much more open, softer foam, this is going to be a problem moving forward for them. Additionally, if we go back to the rods, you can see, again, these rods are very delicate. The carbon in here can be engineered to, be strong in a certain way, under flex, under load, with the support and structure of the Lightstrike Pro foam. But as soon as you put it in a looser foam, in a more open, more airy foam, like it seems like they're going with Lightstrike Evo, then you're going to have problems. In fact, the durability requirements or concerns of the Evo 1, of Adidas saying you're going to get one marathon and maybe a shakeout run before that, let's say 50K, I think that's more to the foam packing out, which is going to give you those pressure points like I just described, but also I think it's a durability problem with these rods. I think the foam is too soft, too open, too airy, that the durability problem that Adidas is having with that shoe, or the thing they're concerned about, is breaking the rods. Because if you have that very soft foam, you're going to pop these rods quite easily. So if you look at a carbon plate, you put that in a soft foam like Zoom X, you're not necessarily going to have any problems because there's a lot more structural rigidity in that. I think there's a few things Adidas can do and explore. The first one is to do sort of a hybrid rod plate where they could put some sort of wings on the rods like you see in this mock-up. That's going to allow them to give those rods a little bit more structural rigidity. Also, it's going to allow the loads to be dispersed across the foam, the softer foam, much more, somewhat protecting these rods and giving them a little bit more material to give them a little bit more firmness and stiffness so they're not breaking as much. You're still going to have the dimensionality problem of the rods because you're still going to feel those in a very soft foam, especially if you're getting a lower stack of foam. But this could work, and I would expect Adidas to explore this. They could also go this route where it's sort of a hybrid where you have rods with more of a plate, and then fingers or toes for the rods. They could also just go straight to the rods with webbing. Think of like a duck's foot. There's webbing between the rods. This would give them the ability to still say they're using the rods, they're marquee technology, but there's going to be a lot more structure in this. And that carbon between the rods themselves could be very thin, very open. It doesn't have to be as thick as a normal carbon plate because the rods themselves do have the rigidity. Those are ultimately what are giving you the pop. The material between the rods is just more of a structural thing to help support the rods themselves. But this could also be very heavy. It could be very difficult to mold. There's a lot of problems with this. Ultimately, from what we've seen in the Prime X2 Strung, I kind of think Adidas is going to drop the rods. Now, that is, I think, very controversial. I have no insider knowledge here, but I think if they drop the rods, they have a lot more freedom. So if they went to a full carbon plate, or they even explored different shapes of carbon plates where they did cutouts in the forefoot, and this style plate is something that they've done before in some of their track shoes, that's going to give them a lot more freedom, a lot more flexibility to really play with the layups of the foams, what foams they're using, and how much foam they're using in combination of the carbon plate, as well as change the structure of the carbon plate itself. So let's go back to the Prime X2 Strung. Now, Adidas has confirmed with some exploded views since release that there are indeed two carbon plates in here. There is a larger one right below the foot, right below the insole of the shoe. Then you have the puck, then you have a secondary plate under that. Like I said in my product analysis of the Prime X2 Strung, again, there's a link in the description if you're interested, that two carbon plates with the softer puck of foam essentially creates an Alpha Fly, an Adidas Alpha Fly. That's essentially the same thing they're doing here. But obviously this shoe's not legal because it has two carbon plates, plus the stack's too high. But the two carbon plates is the bigger problem. So if we look at where the plates sit in the Prime X2 Strung, let's begin to look at that top plate. Now, if we begin to isolate the foams, we can take the Lightstrike Evo, which I think is what that puck of foam is, and then we can call out the two other pieces of Lightstrike Pro they're using. Now, I'm using two colors just to differentiate the top and the bottom piece of how they're molding the shoe. There may be durability or durometer differences between these foams, but it's still Lightstrike Pro. I'm just trying to color code it so you can clearly see what I'm talking about. Adidas has been very clear that there's 3 layers of Lightstrike Pro in here. Again, they're calling that green foam what I'm calling Lightstrike Evo. They're still calling that Lightstrike Pro. So where does this take us in relationship to the Evo 1? So if we look at the Evo 1, we can see that there are carbon rods in here. And again, these are essentially the same rods that are in the Adios Pro 3, but the geometry is different. The point of rocker is moved back towards the midfoot, making the shoe more aggressive. But essentially, where this red line is where the rods sit in this shoe. It's a very Vaporfly-esque ride. Now, if we isolate the foam, we have Lightstrike Evo on top and bottom. Again, I'm using 2 colors in here to distinguish the 2 pieces of how they're molding this shoe. Again, there may be durability differences, but I'm really just trying to color code them so you can see the actual differences that I'm talking about. So this is the shoe that was launched. This is the Evo 1. It has all Lightstrike Evo foam, or what Adidas calls Lightstrike Pro, plus the carbon rods. Now, as I said, the durability problems of this shoe are the Lightstrike Evo foam probably is packing out because it's a new foam for them. I feel like they probably rushed this shoe out to get it out for Berlin because they really wanted what they got in Berlin. But they can solve that. That packing out, the foam sort of compressing, they'll eventually solve that manufacturing process to do that. Nike went through the same thing when the Vaporflies first came out with Zoom X. Zoom X would pack out. You only had maybe 1 or 2 races in it. That's why they were very clear about that. But look at where Zoom X is now. It's sort of a workhorse foam. It is very durable and it'll work very well. I have no doubt that Adidas will get there with Lightstrike Evo. Just right now, in how early the use is for Lightstrike Evo, they're still working through that. But the biggest problem with this general layup of the shoe and what Adidas is sort of warning everyone about, they're making it very clear that this shoe has a very limited shelf life, is yes, the foam will pack out, but it's also going to pack out where you're going to begin to feel the rods because, again, they have dimensionality to them a lot more than a carbon plate. Plus, they're probably breaking them. I guarantee a lot of the athletes that tested this shoe and probably people that are running in it are breaking those rods pretty quickly. What can Adidas do to solve this? And I think that question is what the future of the Adizero line is really going to look like. So let's look at a few layups combining Lightstrike Pro and Lightstrike Evo foam. Now, I do think next spring we're probably going to see a larger consumer release of the Evo 1. It may not be called the Evo 1. It may be the Adios Pro 5. I don't know what it's going to be, but this shoe has been very successful for Adidas, and I think we are going to see a larger release. But to do that, if they're going to stick with the rods, they need to find a way to support those rods. So one way they could do that is combine Lightstrike Pro and Lightstrike Evo in the same layup the shoe has. Basically what they do in the Boston 12. So you put the Lightstrike Evo foam above the rods, under the foot, and then you put Lightstrike Pro, standard Lightstrike Pro, underneath that. This may possibly give the rods enough support where there's more durability. Plus, we know Lightstrike Pro is a great foam. We know it's very durable and it actually wears really well. So maybe this combination of the new foam, the new airy foam under the foot, where you get the feel of it, you get the softness of it, you get the sort of response of it with the standard rod, and then the firmer Lightstrike Pro, maybe that will make this shoe more durable. And again, Adidas already does this with the Boston 12. They do this exact layup, except it's Lightstrike Pro and Lightstrike 2.0. But again, Adidas has mixed foams, and I think this is not far off for what they could do. But I think what's really interesting is remember that sort of Alpha Fly-like technology that is in the Prime X2 Strung. I do think Adidas wants to find a way of bringing that sort of pocket feel in the forefoot into the Adios Pro lineup. Now, a way they could do that in the Evo 1 as it exists right now is something like this. Put Lightstrike Pro under the foot, same carbon rods, then leave the Lightstrike Evo under the rods. So this is going to give you a more stable under the foot, but more cushiony ride overall, especially if you're heel strikers, because there's so much more of the Lightstrike Evo in the heel than there is in the forefoot. Again, the Lightstrike Pro probably, I would guarantee actually, this would give it a lot of structural rigidity. And you're going to get something akin to what ASICS does with the Super Blast, where you get the firmness and response of Lightstrike Pro and the softness of that secondary foam. In ASICS' Super Blast, that's FF Blast Plus. Here, they could use Lightstrike Evo, the new Lightstrike foam, to do that. But I think they could probably push it a little further. And I think that's ultimately what we're going to see. Now, they could go full on Vaporfly. They literally could put in a carbon plate. Now, this is showing a very thin red line, which is just a carbon plate, no rods. Same geometry of the Evo 1, but with a Vaporfly-like carbon plate with Lightstrike Evo on the top and bottom. Now, they have no concerns about breaking the plate because the plate's just not going to break. It's not as fragile as the individual fingers of the rods. Additionally, this shoe's already aggressive like a Vaporfly, where you have the plate very close to the ground in the forefoot and you get the big chunk of Lightstrike Evo, the new Lightstrike Pro foam, under the forefoot. Essentially what Adidas could create here is a Vaporfly. And now that we've heard some reviews of the Evo 1 from just normal runners, a lot of people are comparing it directly to the Vaporfly and how it feels. Adidas could go all in and basically make an Adidas Vaporfly. But I think Nike would not be very happy with this, and I think they would probably put an end to it pretty quickly if Adidas did this, because again, Nike they really watch over plate geometries, and they really control these geometries of the plates because they have patents for everything, and they're very protective of it. They're not gonna, I guarantee they wouldn't let Adidas do this. But I also don't think Adidas necessarily wants to do this. I think there's probably something else that they have in mind, which is probably something like this. Now, if you took a flatter carbon plate, put it directly under the foot, so you have a thin layer of the new foam under the foot, and then you have a large chunk of the new foam, the Lightstrike Evo foam, under the plate. This essentially gives you now what the Metaspeed Sky Plus is doing, but in probably a much softer, better foam. So this is going to allow you to really load up that plate and really push into that foam and get the most out of that foam. Ultimately, this is also going to give you sort of the feel of what Adidas is trying to do with the Prime X2 Strung, where there's this sort of explosive pod of foam in the forefoot. Now, this is Lightstrike Evo, or the new Lightstrike Pro foam, across the entire thing. But we have seen Adidas wanting to mix foams in the past. So they could also go this route, where they put Lightstrike Pro under the foot where the insole is, above this flatter plate. Then they put the Lightstrike Evo, the new Lightstrike Pro foam, just in the forefoot, and then more Lightstrike Pro in the heel. Very similar to the layup of the Adios 8. Now, this ultimately, I think, is probably where we're going to see the Adios Pro 5, because this is going to give you the feel and the technology and the basic sort of idea of what they're trying to do from an engineering standpoint in the Prime X2 Strung, in the lighter package of the Adios Pro, whether it's an Adios Pro 5 or Evo 2 or 3 or whatever it is. This is going to give you, I think, the best of both worlds. It's going to be very durable. It's going to be very responsive. It's going to be very propulsive. You're going to get the best of the newer, softer foam. You're going to get the durability of Lightstrike Pro foam. This could be the shoe. Adidas could also go the route of what they do in the Adizero SL by encasing a puck of Lightstrike Evo, the new Lightstrike Pro foam, in the forefoot of just a Lightstrike Pro midsole. I think this probably is going to be the most direct to what ultimately they're trying to do in the Prime X2 Strung, because again, you are loading up this puck of foam in the forefoot only, very much like an AirPod from an Alphafly, and it could be a very interesting ride. The problem is, I think that softer foam might get diluted quite a bit in the Lightstrike Pro. The firmer Lightstrike Pro foam might not be as responsive, but if we go back to this layup, this one could be a little bit too squishy possibly. And there could be some, maybe the new Lightstrike Evo foam is just too soft compared to the older Lightstrike Pro foam that it's just not going to work. But I ultimately think we're going to see a plate configuration like this. I do think we're going to see Adidas go to plates, and I think we're going to see them begin to play with layups of these new foams and using these foams together in their Adizero line. So there you go. Those are my thoughts on what the implications for all of this technology and where it's going to lead the Adizero line. Now, we have seen leaked images of a Takumi Sen 10, whether that's the final one or not, I don't know. But it doesn't look fundamentally different from the Takumi Sen 8 or 9. So whatever they're playing with this technology and integrating it into the Adizero line, it's going to come to the Adios Pro line first. Because Adidas has been very clear that that is their marquee marathon racing shoe. And if they make it more versatile, more propulsive, more aggressive, like they've already done in the Evo 1, it becomes a great all-around racer shoe, very much like a Vaporfly. Now, if they begin to play with carbon plates, different configurations of the plates, mixing the foams, again, it just makes the Adios Pro much more versatile, much more focused on all types of road racing, but still performing exceptionally well at the marathon distance. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. If you like this type of content, consider subscribing because you'll see more content like this pop up in your feed. If not, drop a like on this video because it helps this channel continue to grow, which I always appreciate. And with that, I'll catch you in the next one.